Introversion, introspection, reflection, quietness. Those four words have followed me most of my life. Not like a shadow, more like a frequency. Something humming beneath everything I do, the way I move through rooms, the way I sit with people without needing to fill the air between us. I think a lot about my demeanor sometimes. Not with anxiety, exactly, more like curiosity. Because there's something strange about being a person who has so much to say and yet sometimes says nothing at all. Why? I'm stuck deep in thought most of the time, contemplating profound concepts and ideas, constantly processing emotions and thoughts about the future. All of these thoughts have rendered me quiet, and for a long time I mistook that quietness for a flaw, like something in me was miscalibrated, like I should want to talk more, perform more, fill more space. But here's what I've come to understand. There is a kind of person in this world who lives mostly on the inside, who experiences things twice, once in real time and once again, alone, later, turning it over in their mind like a stone in a river, feeling its weight, steadying its edges. That kind of depth doesn't make for great small talk, and that's okay. I often wonder how others perceive me when they encounter a person who isn't so quick to make small talk. Maybe it comes off as rude, unsociable, or even selfish. I've seen that look, the slight confusion when someone expects a quicker, warmer, more effortless exchange, and I just don't deliver it. But it's not that I don't like to talk or socialize. I find it more like I like to talk when there's something substantial and meaningful to talk about, and that perhaps my conversation style is a little different. Others may want to fill the silence because it makes them feel uncomfortable or awkward. But for me, silence is a marker of feeling comfortable with people, not having to force conversation, just letting it flow. Silence isn't empty, it's honest. And the older I get, the more I recognize that the pressure to be louder, more outgoing, more available and expressive on demand, that pressure never really came from inside me. It came from outside, from a world that tends to reward performance over presence. My quiet demeanor is simply a sign of my introversion, something that I had felt I should change at one point, but then realized there's nothing wrong with being an introvert. I actually like to be introverted and am proud of my natural quietness. I actually do have a lot to say. It's just that sometimes I feel like I want to engage with an audience who is receptive to what I'm saying. I don't want to just talk for the sake of talking to a person who may not be too interested in what I have to say. That might sound a little selective, and maybe it is. But I think there's something powerful about knowing your own frequency and choosing not to broadcast it to every station, waiting for the ones who are actually tuned in. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone in the best possible way? Like your inner world was so full, so alive, that the noise around you just faded. What does that feel like for you? And have you ever wondered if that quietness is a gift you've been taught to apologize for? There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being misunderstood in a room full of people. You walk in, you're present, you're observing, absorbing, taking everything in, and somewhere across the room, someone clocks your quietness and fills in the blank themselves. Cold, arrogant, distant, unbothered. None of those are true, but you've stopped correcting people. I've been called intimidating by people who later became close friends, which always struck me as strange because inside I'm one of the warmest, most curious people I know. I genuinely want to understand the people around me. I'm fascinated by what makes someone who they are. I just don't announce that the moment I walk through a door. And I think that's where the misread happens. We live in a world that has very specific ideas about what warmth is supposed to look like. It's supposed to be loud, immediate, effusive, a big smile from across the room, a fast handshake, a rapid exchange of surface-level pleasantries that signals, I'm safe,
I'm open, I'm here. But what if your warmth is just slower? What if it runs deeper rather than wider? What if you're the kind of person who doesn't hand out pieces of themselves at the door, but when they finally let someone in, they realize they've been given something rare? That doesn't translate well in a 30-second first impression. So people project. And honestly, I've made peace with that. Because I've come to understand that the way someone reads your silence says far more about their own relationship with stillness than it does about you. A person who is uncomfortable with silence will always mistake it for hostility. A person who has never sat with their own thoughts will always find someone who does suspicious. What they're really reacting to is the unfamiliarity of a person who doesn't need to perform. And that's the thing about introverts that nobody really talks about. We're not withholding, we're just not performing. There's a difference. Withholding is intentional, protective, a wall. Not performing is just being, existing in a space without narrating yourself in real time for the comfort of others. I've watched extroverted people light up a room and genuinely admired it. That gift is real. The ability to make a stranger feel at ease in seconds, that's not shallow, that's a skill. But it's not the only way to make someone feel seen. Some of us make people feel seen by listening so carefully that when we finally do speak, they feel like they've been understood at a level they didn't expect. Some of us make people comfortable by never pretending, by not laughing at things that aren't funny, not nodding along when we're somewhere else entirely. There's an honesty in that stillness that, once someone recognizes it, they tend to trust completely. The misread is painful sometimes. I won't pretend it isn't. There have been rooms I've left behind knowing I left behind a version of myself that wasn't real, a version someone else invented in the 15 minutes they gave me. But I've also learned this: the people who wait, who don't fill in the blank, who sit with the quiet long enough to hear what's underneath it, those are the people worth talking to. And here's what I want to ask you. Has anyone ever told you that you seem intimidating or cold or hard to read? And when they finally got to know you, what did they find that surprised them most? Growing up, I experienced an identity crisis. Not the kind that announces itself cleanly with a single dramatic moment you can point to later and say, that's where it started. No, mine was quieter than that. More like a slow fog that settled over everything, a persistent low-grade confusion that followed me from room to room, school to school, social circle to social circle. I didn't know who I was. And as a child of first-generation immigrants, the question was never simple. It wasn't just, who am I? It was, who am I supposed to be? Who should I assimilate to? What accent should I have? What culture am I really part of? My parents? The ones I grew up around? The people that I saw on TV? What accent do I have? That last one sounds small. It isn't, because accent is more than sound. It's belonging. It's a signal you send before you've said a single meaningful word. And when you're not sure which signal to send, you start to feel like a transmission that doesn't quite land anywhere. It was a whirlwind, growing up in a melting pot of different lifestyles, encountering so many different types of personalities, habits, preferences, a maze. And at the center of that maze was a question I couldn't answer. Who am I deep down inside? I watched the kids around me seem to know, or at least they seemed more certain. They had a clear tribe, a clear sound, a clear way of moving through the world. I kept trying on different ones, borrowing a little from here, a little from there, feeling like an imposter in each version, never fully landing. It was unsettling to feel that I couldn't ground myself to understand who I really am, like standing on a floor that keeps shifting beneath you, never letting you find your footing long enough to actually stand up straight. And then, decades later, not all at once, but gradually, it finally clicked. I don't actually have to adhere to any single culture. That sounds obvious now, but when you spent years feeling like the answer was somewhere out there, in the right group, the right label, the right identity to claim, the realization that the answer was never out there at all, that's not small. That's everything. My identity is just that, an amalgamation of many different ideas. There are many archetypes that I can think of that I relate to, that I can identify with, not just one. Many cultures, many ideas that I can mix and match, because during formative years, I absorbed so many different kinds of cultures. The confusion I once felt wasn't a flaw in my development. It was the development. All that absorption, all that observation, all those different rooms I passed through without fully belonging, I was collecting. I just didn't know it yet. Today, I'm proud to say that I am a mix of everything that I grew up with. All of my preferences are versatile in nature. I don't have to lean towards one specific thing or another. My identity is formed from many different identities. The writer, the psychoanalyst, the technologist, and so many more. I won't go into every single one of them now, but what I will say is this. Understanding who I am deep down inside is an ongoing journey, a very fun one at that. And maybe that's the reframe worth sitting with. What if identity was never meant to be a destination? What if the people who seem most fully themselves aren't the ones who found the answer, but the ones who got comfortable living inside the question? So I want to ask you, when you think about who you are, do you feel like you're supposed to choose? And what parts of yourself have you been quietly carrying that you haven't yet given a name to?
There's something you learn to do, almost without realizing it. You walk into a room, and before you've said a word, before you've even taken your coat off, you've already read it. The energy, the demographics, the unspoken expectations. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a switch flips. Posture adjusts. Vocabulary shifts. The cadence of your sentences changes. Even your laugh, the timing of it, the volume, recalibrates. And by the time you've said hello, you are already a slightly different version of yourself than the one who walked in. This is code switching. And if you grew up navigating multiple worlds the way I did, you didn't learn it from a book. You learned it the way you learned to swim, by being thrown in repeatedly and figuring out that sinking wasn't an option. As a child of immigrants, I lived in at least two worlds simultaneously. There was the world inside my home, the language, the food, the values, the rhythms of a culture my parents carried across an ocean and rebuilt from memory. And then there was the world outside that door, which had its own language, its own rhythms, its own unspoken rules about how to be, how to sound, how much space you were allowed to take up. And I moved between them every single day. For a long time, I thought this made me less, like I was somehow diluted, not fully one thing, not fully the other, a translation that loses something in every version. I watched other kids who seemed to exist in only one world, and I envied the simplicity of it, the ease, the not having to think about which self to bring into the room. But here's what I understand now that I couldn't then. Code switching is not inauthenticity, it's fluency. There's a difference between performing a version of yourself to survive, which is exhausting and real and worth acknowledging, and genuinely being multilingual in the human sense, knowing how to read a room, knowing how to meet people where they are, knowing that the self is not a single fixed point, but something more like water, taking the shape of whatever it's poured into, without ever losing its nature. The people who only know one register, one tone, one way of moving through the world, they often mistake adaptation for dishonesty. They see the shift and call it fake, but what they're really seeing is range, and range is a gift most people spend their whole lives trying to develop. That said, I won't romanticize it entirely. There were rooms I walked into where no version of me was going to be enough, where the switching wasn't a superpower, it was a tax, where I'd leave feeling hollowed out, like I'd spent something I couldn't quite replenish. That exhaustion is real, the labor of it is real, and it deserves to be named. But what I've come to believe is this: the goal was never to stop code switching. The goal was to do it consciously, to know that I'm doing it, to choose when and how, and to never confuse the version I'm performing for the one that exists when no one is left to perform for. That version, the underneath all the registers, all the adaptations, all the learned fluency, that's the one worth knowing. And I'm still getting acquainted with him. So let me ask you this. When you walk into a room and feel yourself shift, change your tone, your posture, the way you present, do you experience that as freedom or as loss? And have you ever stopped to ask which version of you shows up when there's no one left to perform for?
Sometimes there are hidden places in my mind that only I know of. Not metaphorically, I mean actual places, rooms, corridors, specific textures of feeling that I can navigate by memory, that exist somewhere between language and experience, between a thing that happened and the version of that thing that lives on inside me, still warm, still breathing. Almost like a secret world, one that's very specific to me, my history, my experiences, my consciousness. And I know that sounds like something everyone might say. Maybe it is. But that's the thing about these hidden places. They're not universal. They're particular. They're mine in a way that I can't fully transfer, can't fully explain, can't upload into someone else's understanding no matter how precise my words get. I think everyone has these hidden places too. Situations that are so unique to their individual experience that they evoke a very unique emotion, one that may not even have a name. We only feel that emotion when it's felt by us individually. It arrives without announcement. It doesn't come with a label you can look up. It just arrives, familiar and strange at the same time, like running into a version of yourself you forgot existed. I can think of a few of these emotions, but where could I even begin to describe them? I guess it would take me a while to define how they were shaped, to trace the specific sequence of people, places, and moments that conspired to create a feeling this particular, and what well-known emotions they resemble, because they do resemble things. They're not entirely alien. They borrow from grief and from joy, from nostalgia, and from something sharper than nostalgia. They're compounds, hybrids, emotional alloys made from circumstances so specific that no one else could have forged them in quite the same way. And then again, would I really want to define them? There's something about naming a thing too precisely that can diminish it, like pinning a butterfly to a board. It's still beautiful, technically, but something essential has left it. Some hidden places are worth protecting from the full light of analysis, worth keeping partially in the dark, not because they're shameful, but because the darkness is part of what they are. And yet, I do like to recognize these hidden places sometimes for what they are. Assign names to them so that I can identify them, so that I can easily refer to them when I find myself there again. It helps me understand them better and understand myself better whenever I find myself in my own hidden places. Not clinical names, not diagnoses or categories from a psychology textbook, personal names, private ones, the kind of name only you would understand, because only you know what it refers to. I have a few of these, emotional landmarks, places in my inner geography that I can say, I've been here before. I know this terrain. I know how long I usually stay. I know what I tend to bring back with me. There's something quietly powerful about that kind of self-knowledge, not the kind you perform, not the kind you post about, the kind that just sits in you solid and private, like a stone at the bottom of a river you're the only one who swims in. A secret world that's very specific to you. And I think the question worth sitting with is this: what are the hidden places in your mind that no word has ever quite reached? The feelings that arrive and leave without a name that only you would recognize? And have you ever tried to name one just for yourself, just so you'd know where you'd been?
The mind keeps things without asking permission. That's the part that gets me. You don't decide what stays. You don't curate the collection consciously. Don't sit down and deliberate over what deserves to be preserved and what gets released. The mind just keeps what it keeps and discards what it discards. And half the time, you don't discover what made the cut until something unexpected trips a wire years later, and a moment you'd completely forgotten surfaces with startling clarity. I think about this a lot. The archive. Not the official memory, the one you can access on demand, the facts and dates and names and faces you filed neatly away. I mean the other one. The one running underneath. The one that stores things not by category, but by feeling, that files a specific quality of afternoon light next to a conversation that happened a decade later, because something about them felt the same, that keeps the smell of a room you were in once, briefly, at 7 years old, and has no idea why. There's no logic to what gets archived, or rather, the logic is entirely emotional, entirely interior, entirely yours. Some of the most vivid things in my archive are not the big moments, not the graduations, the milestones, the events that were supposed to matter. It's the smaller things that survived. A specific way someone laughed, the weight of a particular silence in a particular room, the exact color of a sky on a day when everything was about to change, before I knew it was about to change. The archive caught it anyway. And then there are the gaps. Entire stretches of time I should be able to recall and can't. Not because they were bad necessarily, just unarchived. Like the mind looked at them and quietly decided, nothing essential here, move on. Which raises a question I find genuinely unsettling. What does it mean about a period of your life if the archive kept almost nothing from it? Were you not fully present? Was nothing landing deeply enough to stick? Or does absence have its own meaning? The archive's silence as a kind of verdict? I don't have a clean answer to that. What I do know is that the things the archive keeps tend to be honest in a way your conscious memory isn't. Conscious memory edits. It revises, smooths over, reshapes itself to fit the story you're currently telling about your life. But the archive doesn't do that. It just holds the raw material, the unprocessed original, the version of a moment before you decided what it meant. Which means sometimes, when something surfaces unexpectedly, it doesn't match the story at all. You thought you'd made peace with something, and then the archive returns a file and you realize, no, you just stopped looking at it. It's been sitting here the whole time, exactly as you left it, waiting with tremendous patience for you to be ready. There's something both haunting and beautiful about that. The idea that nothing is ever really gone, that the interior world is a place of extraordinary preservation, that somewhere in the depths of you, every version of yourself that has ever existed is still on file, still accessible, still real, still waiting to tell you something you haven't heard yet. So let me ask you this. What's something your mind has kept that you didn't expect it to? A moment, a detail, a feeling so small it had no right to survive, and yet here it is, years later, still completely intact. What do you think the archive was trying to save it for? Romance is a concept that I like to keep in the forefront of my mind. Not the way the word usually gets used. Not candlelit dinners and declarations. Not roses or grand gestures, or the particular anxiety of new love. That's not what I mean. Or at least, it's not all I mean. To me, romance is not necessarily a term I use to refer to love between lovers. It's more of an experience, a quality of attention, a way of moving through the world where the ordinary suddenly becomes luminous, where something as simple as the angle of late afternoon sun through a window can stop you mid-step and make you feel, briefly and completely, that being alive is an extraordinary privilege. Picture this, an impressionistic painting, not the subject of it, the feeling of standing in front of it, the way the edges blur just enough that your imagination has to finish the scene. A beautiful song by Chopin, not background music, Chopin listened to alone, in the dark, with full attention. The way it does something to the architecture of your chest that language can't quite reach. Or this, a song that plays over and over in a specific year, over a warm summer night with fireflies lighting up the evening. That right there. For some people, romance arrives through people. For me, it arrives mostly through atmosphere, through the specific combinations of light and temperature and sound and season that conspire together into something that feels almost curated, as if the world briefly arranged itself just to move you. And no season does this better, for me, than summer. Summer is one of my favorite seasons. I love the smell of fresh-cut grass, and not just the warmth of summer, but the actual heat, the kind that presses against you when you step outside, that makes your skin aware of itself, that makes me feel alive in a way that nothing else quite replicates. There's something about heat that strips everything back to the essential. You're just a body in the world, breathing warm air, and it's enough. It's more than enough. I visualize glowing candles in the dark, campfires, walks by the lake, starry nights so dense with light they feel almost aggressive in their beauty, like the universe is showing off and doesn't particularly care whether you're ready for it. And the nights, the summer nights especially, the buzz of people dining out and about, voices and laughter and the clink of glasses drifting from restaurant patios. There is something about that ambient human warmth, all those lives briefly intersecting under the same warm sky, that serves to inspire me heavily. Not because I necessarily want to be in the middle of it, but because witnessing it reminds me that the world is full of people who are also, in their own way, alive to something, feeling something, chasing their own version of this. And I wonder a lot, how is it for others? What comes to mind when they think of romance? Because I think everyone has a version, a beautiful, treasured emotion that can have so many forms, be experienced in so many different ways, and mean so many different things to different people based on their own experiences. For one person, it's the smell of old books and rain. For another, it's a particular highway at night with the right song on. For another, it's a kitchen full of noise and family and something on the stove. Romance, in this sense, is less a feeling and more a frequency, one that certain moments, places, and sensation manage to tune you into, briefly, completely, unforgettably. And the beautiful thing is that it keeps coming back, unbidden, unearned, just given. So let me ask you this. When the world arranges itself just right, and something in you goes completely still and completely alive at the same time, what does that look like for you? What's the specific combination of things that lifts you into that feeling? And have you ever tried to name what it actually is? There's a specific kind of romance that only arrives when no one else is around. I've noticed this for years. The way certain evenings feel different when you're alone in them. Not lesser,
different, sharper somehow, more available. Like the experience has more room to expand when it isn't being shared. When you're not also managing someone else's reaction to it, not half monitoring whether they're feeling what you're feeling, not translating it in real time into something communicable. When you're alone, you can be completely inside a moment. No commentary, no performance, no version of yourself curated for company. Just you and the thing itself. I think that's what people misunderstand about solitude. They hear it, and they hear loneliness. They imagined a lack, an absence of connection, a table set for one, something missing from the frame. But solitude isn't the failure to be with others. It's the choice to be fully with yourself. And there's a profound difference. Some of my most romantic experiences, in the fullest sense of that word, have happened entirely alone. A night walk when the rest of the neighborhood is asleep and the streets belong only to you. The particular quality of that silence, not empty silence, but inhabited silence. The trees, the pools of streetlight, the distant sound of a train somewhere. All of it somehow more vivid because there's no one to point it at. You can't say, look at that. You just have to absorb it. Let it land wherever it lands, unmediated. Or an afternoon that was supposed to be ordinary, nothing scheduled, nowhere to be, and you find yourself making coffee slowly, deliberately, actually tasting it, putting on a record, not as background, but as the main event, sitting somewhere comfortable as the light shifts across the room. The whole afternoon just opening up like a room you forgot was there. There's a word in Portuguese, saudade, a longing for something beautiful that may never come again or may never have fully existed. It's considered untranslatable, but I think solitude at its most romantic produces something adjacent to saudade, this exquisite awareness that the moment you're in is already becoming the past, that you are, right now, living something you will one day remember. And there's a tenderness in that, a preciousness that company sometimes dilutes. This is not an argument against connection. I want to be clear about that. The warmth of other people, the shared meal, the long conversation, the comfortable silence of being known by someone, that carries its own irreplaceable romance. I've written about that. I feel that. But I've also learned that if you can't find romance alone, you'll always be slightly dependent on others to provide it. You'll always need the right company, the right atmosphere, the right conditions supplied from outside, and that's a fragile way to live. The person who has learned to be moved by their own company, who can walk into a quiet evening alone and find it full rather than empty, that person carries their romance with them. It's not dependent on circumstance. It doesn't require the right other person in the room. It's portable. It's yours. And I think that's one of the quietest, most underrated forms of freedom there is. So let me ask you this. When was the last time you were completely alone and felt not lonely, but full? Not waiting for something to begin, not recovering from something that ended, just present and moved and glad to be exactly where you were. And if you can't remember, what do you think has been standing between you and that?